Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Suzanne Kianpour, BBC News, and our esteemed panel.
Hello, and welcome to today's session with the world-renowned economist, Dr. Nouriel Roubini of New York University. He's going to discuss with us his book, MegaThreats, 10 Dangerous Trends That Imperil Our Future and How to Survive Them. Hopefully it'll be a bit more uplifting than the title.
Or worse.
So I'd like to start with what was the defining moment that prompted you to write this book?
Well, I'm not sure if there was one defining moment, but I think at the beginning of this COVID crisis, I'm an economist. I've been writing about economic and financial crisis. That has been my expertise, well known for predicting a global financial crisis. But I've always had a more broad interest. So I saw on one side this pandemic. I saw much worsening of global climate change and the relations between pandemics and climate change. Used to go to China, and I saw the beginning of this Cold War between US and China, but not just between the US and China, but between the West and a number of revisionist powers. We had Trump president and rise of populism of extreme right and left in a number of countries, both advanced economies and emerging markets, and therefore a backlash against liberal democracy. And I saw also, and I started using some AI, and I realized what could be a threat to jobs and labor income and so on. So I went beyond my traditional economic and financial expertise to think about social, political, geopolitical, environmental, health, and technological risk, and how they're related to each other. You know, of course, there are entire books written on climate change, pandemic, you name it. But I think that people miss the connection between these different risks. And I wanted to take a holistic approach. That was the idea, something big beyond just economic and financial risks.
So of these threats that you've laid out on a kind of macro level, what are some specific conditions responsible for the growth of these threats?
Well, some of them existed before, but the way I see it is that when I was growing up, you know, I have a gray hair in the 60s in Italy, I must say that I was not worried about climate change destroying the planet. People were barely talking, the Club of Rome, about limits to growth. It was not an issue. After the détente between the US and the Soviet Union, nobody really worried about a nuclear war. It was a liberal democracies, stable, at least in the West and so on. Economic and financial cycles were reasonably stable. Yeah, we had stagflation in the 70s, but it went away. You know, nobody worried about AI, robotic, and automation destroying most jobs. Nobody worried about the nuclear war between great powers. Nobody worried about deglobalization. So we all grew up, at least most of us, in an environment where some of these threats were not even in the people's mind. And instead, today, suddenly these things are becoming serious, and they're connected with each other. And we tend to project history. We believe that the last 75 years have been of relative peace and prosperity. Not that there have not been wars, but not the wars between major powers. There have been economic cycles, but maybe not severe. So we tend to essentially extrapolate and think that the last 75 years of relatively global peace, prosperity, and rise of welfare for most of humanity may continue in the future. But if you think about what happened before, the period between 1918 and 1945, you had two world wars, you had the Great Depression, you had financial crisis, you had the rise of authoritarian regimes from Germany to Italy to Spain to Japan. We had the Holocaust, we had World War II, we had the Great Depression, and we had the Korean War. So I fear that some of these threats that are really mega threats, they're not just minor, may be emerging now, and I think it leads us to a world that looks more like those 30 plus years between 1918 and 1945, as opposed to the period after 1945. And that was one of the reasons of writing this book about these threats.
in this age of geopolitical rivalries and polarization, at the beginning of this year, we were hearing the words World War II a lot because of the invasion of Ukraine by Putin. How can societies cooperate efficiently now in the face of these mega threats? Are we at a place again where what you just mapped out in the kind of pre-1945 era, are we there again?
Well, unfortunately, each one of these threats, of course, has a potential solution to them, but the solution requires both within countries, domestic cooperation between different social and political groups, and some of these threats, as what economists call, have global externalities. They're not just domestic, like climate change. If one country reduces to zero greenhouse emissions and nobody else does, then there's a free rider problem. And the problem we're facing is that because on one side there is a backlash against liberal democracy, and liberal democracy I grew up with, there were parties of the right and the left, always been so, but they were not so radically polarized. There was not such a lack of bipartisanship in Europe or US in advanced economies, so that's worse. So resolving problems at the domestic level is hard enough, and we're unable to do stuff that's structural. And now because there are these geopolitical rivalries, we cannot resolve them at the global level either. I mean, look what happened during COVID with the response to the pandemic, with US and China and other countries going in totally different directions and not cooperating at all. Of course, economic and financial crisis require cooperation, climate change, pandemics, lots of other things. And of course, in a world of great powers, you need the cooperation between great powers to provide global public goods. In the past, we used to have an hegemon. In the 19th century, the British Empire with the Pax Britannica. After World War II, the American Empire that provided global public goods. Now we live in a world in which there are US, China, India, Europe, lots of great powers, and they seem to disagree on most things. So it's becoming even harder to cooperate globally. And many of these problems require global cooperation. If it's not, then it's going to be a bit of a disaster.
So I'm currently working on a documentary for the BBC on the Iran-Israel shadow war. How big of a threat among these emerging threats, mega threats that you call them, how big of a threat is the Iranian nuclear threat?
Well, there is a chapter about the geopolitical mega threats, and of course I speak about how there is a number of revisionist powers that are effectively allied with each other. China, Russia, Iran, North Korea, and Pakistan that is close to China, that are challenging the world economic and political and geopolitical order that, of course, the US, Europe, and the West created after World War II. And it has many dimensions, these things. And within them, the issue about Iran, I think, is a serious one. Doesn't look like we're going to get a deal with a new joint comprehensive plan of action. I think that Iran has even given up. I'm actually Persian Jew, and I understand that you are half Persian. But Iran has given up on the US because even if they get a deal, 2 years from now, either Trump or another Republican could come to power and then renege on it. So I think they've essentially strategically decided we're going to be in bed or embedded economically and politically with China and Russia because we cannot trust the West. So Iran, from this point of view, is gone unless there is a regime change of some sort. And because of that, they believe that the only way in which they can maintain regime stability and avoid the risk of regime change is by getting the nuclear weapon. Countries like Pakistan, we cannot do regime change. In Libya and other places we did. They didn't have the bomb. So that's the lesson. So I think there is a slow motion train wreck where on one side Israel believes that this is an existential threat. Iran believes that the only way they ensure no regime change is having the bomb. And then at some point, a war could occur. And in the 1970s, again, stagflation was triggered by two geopolitical shocks. One, the Yom Kippur War between Israel and Arab states in 1973 that led to a spike in oil prices. And then the 1979 Iranian Revolution led to another oil embargo and spike in oil prices. So if that confrontation were to occur, it's not just political and militarily a disaster for the Gulf, but economic consequences for the entire global economy will be a massive shock like the 70s. I mean, it's bad enough right now with Russia, Ukraine, and the spike in oil, natural gas, and energy prices. If there was a war between Iran and the West, it'll be even worse. It's a serious risk, yeah.
Climate change, you mentioned climate change.
Yeah.
Climate change is undoubtedly a universal threat, a massive universal threat. However, it seems that the international response has been lackluster. Why is that? Are domestic concerns contributing to this? Why is climate change seemingly not really taken seriously for the threat that it truly is?
For many reasons, it's not taken seriously. Unfortunately, there's a lot of talk, but a lot of it is greenwashing, green wishing, and variety of green fig leaves. So there's more talk than action. Even Glassman, I think, was just as a failure. Several things. At the domestic level, there are divergences of views, say in the US between Republicans and Democrats. So some people deny the human factors. Secondly, there are again global divergences. China and India say, you created this problem for the last 200 years with the Industrial Revolution, and now you want us to cut our emissions to zero right now when we're still poor and growing. We need still to emit for a long time before we're going to reduce it. So there are those kind of things. There are also intergenerational conflicts. I'm old enough, I'm not going to be around the next 30 years, but people are young, are going to live for another 60, 80 years or whatever, and they care more about the future than maybe I do care. I do care about climate change, but most people tend to be a little bit selfish. And there is a global public good point of it. If a country does action on global climate change and others don't, you have the typical tragedy of the commons or national equilibrium or free hardware problem. If you do it individually, nobody else does, then nothing happens, and therefore your incentive to do something. So there are lots of reasons why it's very hard to cooperate nationally and also internationally and intergenerationally.
How big of a concern is cyber security among these mega threats, and particularly the weaponization of cyber capabilities?
It certainly is one of the threats that I consider. Of course, there is a chapter about how AI, machine learning, robotic and automation may lead eventually to most jobs, not just routine and cognitive, but even creative jobs go away. But then one of the elements of the threat is, of course, cyber warfare. In addition to traditional conventional wars and unconventional wars, I think in the future we'll see more cyber, especially because those revisionist powers that are challenging the US from a military point of view and nuclear point of view, with the exception of Russia, they cannot challenge the United States or the West, and therefore asymmetric warfare that has to do with cyber, trying to undermine our own democracies, already divided by creating and sowing more confusion, more divisions, more lack of partisanship and so on, is the tool that actually is quite cheap, that even North Korea and Iran, let alone Russia or China and others can use. So I think that the next dimension of warfare is going to be certainly cyber. And on one side, we have pandemics that spread globally. There's like a virus spreading, but of course the viruses are coming from cyber warfare is also significant. And also, leaving aside the political cost, there are also economic costs, because it's one of the factors that I discuss in the book that is stagflationary, reduces growth and increases the cost of production, because if you have to protect yourself as a firm, individual, or a government against cyber, you have to spend a fortune, and that increases the cost of production, reduces potential growth. And every day there's a cyber attack against one firm or another and so on. So it's also economically costly, not just politically.
In the media, we're often talking about the problems and not so much the solutions. So to maybe lighten the mood a bit, do you believe catastrophe is avoidable? And how can we avoid it?
Well, there are 10 chapters in the book. In each one of them, I talk about these mega threats: economic, financial, monetary, social, political, geopolitical, environmental, health, technological. And then there are two chapters, 11 and 12, where there are two paths for the future. One is more utopian or less dystopian, where both domestically and internationally we do the right thing and we avoid the total disaster. And the other one is dystopian, where each one of these things materializes and they feed on each other. And as I say, and I don't have time to discuss it, but each one of these threats are related to each other. They're interconnected. So either we resolve them in an interconnected way or we don't. So there is a dystopian future that is really total disaster, where we can destroy this planet in 5 different ways. And there is one that is less dystopian. Maybe not utopian, because there'll be still conflict, there'll be still rivalry, there'll be still issues, but we manage it in a way. So, and I explain the policy lead to one or the other. In the epilogue of the book, my personal view is that as of now, the dystopian scenario is more likely than the utopian, because I see the lack of domestic and international willingness and cooperation to address this problem. That's a personal view. But for each one of these problems, there is a solution, and there's a holistic solution for all of them. I hope we go in the right direction rather than dystopian. I worry that we're going to go in the wrong direction. And the book, in part, is about warning people about this stuff. This is very different from the past of what we have observed for the last 75 years. I think that's why we're facing mega threats.
As part of our closing, what can every person, each and every person in this room, do to avoid a dystopian future?
Of course, there are things we can do at the individual level. We can do it also as member of societies, organization, private, public, corporate, in our political kind of engagement, and so on. Many of these threats, of course, are mega, and therefore they can be dealt at the national level and global. Individual cannot really, individually, actually, on global climate change, if each of us start eating less meat and using more green kind of tools and so on, we can individually actually go in the right direction. But of course, the solutions are more at the national and the international level. But there are things that, of course, individual organization, corporation, non-profits, and so on, cooperating together can do. But we have to do the sacrifices also at the personal level. We're going to just say they have to be done. And especially on climate change, unless we change the way we behave, the way we consume, and we have to do sacrifices to reduce our carbon footprint at the personal level. Before we do it at the national level, we're not going to have a solution. And everybody has to pay some price and cost for it.
And finally, what is the one thing that you want the audience to take away from your book about megathreats?
I would say that, as I said, we're extrapolating from the past. And because of technology, we believe that the future, the next 10, 20 years, is going to be as good or similar to the recent past. So I want to warn that maybe there is a regime change. There's a break. There's a quantum change. And the kind of threats we're facing today are significantly quantitatively different from those we've faced in the last 70 years, and they interact with each other. And while it's a slow motion train wreck, and that's why there's not the same urgency of something like a natural disaster, these slow motion train wrecks are accelerating, and if we're not starting to resolve each one of these things individually and together, we're going to end up into a very, very ugly place. So it's a warning and it's a call for action.
Dr. Roubini, thank you.